Well, hell. Welcome back to Tech Travel and Twang. Well, hi there. Welcome back to Tech Travel and Twang, our Tuesday Tea edition. I'm Jenn Barbee, Chief Disruptor at Destination Innovate. I have with me our Chief Experience Officer and co-founder, Kristen Cruz. Hi, Kristen.
Hey, Jen. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm excited to dig into our tea today. We're going to talk about owned media, destination podcast. We're going to talk about a country whose doctors actually prescribe travel. And we're going to hit the conferences for August. So I'm ready to dig in. How about you, Kristen?
Oh, yes, super ready to dig in. I feel like we always bring some really good tea fodder to our Tuesday tea, but today I'm really excited to dig in on some more like mainstream topics. This is
Mm-hmm.
podcasts and destinations is a big topic right now. So I'm
It
excited.
it is, and it's such a good idea. Always, I totally support, growing your own media assets for a destination. But it was podcast popped off, and it was such a good idea, and these destinations took these podcasts on, which is amazing. But then you've got to think about the appetite of the traveler too. So I think we're at like a crossroads of like, what do we do with these now?
Huh. Well, and I think too, there are lots of things, right, in our realm of advertising and media that makes sense, generally speaking, and podcasts are one of them. We know that podcasts are not going away, right? We all have to interact within a podcast or kind of formulate that into our plans in some form or fashion. But there's also that area of these types of mediums where we have to think about it from the user's perspective. And when it comes to destinations, one of the biggest issues I think has been the amount of content a user is going to want to digest and continuously digest
That's the point.
while
Exactly. Like,
planning the trip, right? And then there's so much more that it's like peeling an onion at that point, right? It's like so many layers to like answering that question, and depending on your destination, depending on your traveler, it is very different for everyone.
but I think what doubles down, or where the opportunity is right there, is the residents. We go back to DMO relevancy, keeping DMOs relevant. Those residents, like your community, should be your number one saturation
Absolutely.
point for those podcasts, because you're right, the traveler appetite is different, and we can't change how people want to travel. So I'd probably listen to, if I'm going to, especially if I'm going to a big trip, like an overseas trip, I'm probably going to listen to a couple of podcasts, get my tips out of there. And then I'm going to take the trip. And then I'm not going to necessarily subscribe. Or even if I do subscribe, I'm not consuming that content constantly
Right.
after that.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's where it comes down to who the audience is for your podcast. As a destination,
Mhm.
I think the why are we doing this has to be really well defined and answered really early up front. Otherwise, as you're putting together your topics and you're kind of outlining your plan for your podcast, things start falling apart. Like we've seen so many destinations start to struggle with who's
There's
on
an
the podcast,
inflection
what are
point.
they covering? Yeah, who are they
Mhm.
talking to? What do the guests look like? As they continuously refine what that content is. And so and the struggle, we've seen the struggle with the following numbers start to emerge. Like it's a lot more difficult. Again, like if you're not looking at your community as your foundation for your podcast.
But if you're already here, and a lot of us are, right, in terms of producing and putting that time and investment in that podcast, really, I'd focus on those special episodes for travelers that make a lot of sense for those further off travelers, but really tight in residence and also super short drive market. So if I'm a super short drive market, I'm probably going to be listening to that podcast because I don't know what weekend I might just pop off and want to take my family. So I think
Right.
that's where that opportunity is too. But yeah, I think we're in an inflection point. And also, what's interesting is podcast popularity hasn't waned, but new subscriptions are starting to come down. Like people are like, okay, this is what I listen to. They aren't necessarily adding on a bunch of new ones.
Well, yeah, because there's so much to consume out there, and our time is very precious. And so you're dedicating for those that you're truly subscribing to, right? And that you're digesting on a weekly or by however often,
Mhm.
That those are your podcasts. That's what you have time to dig in and listen to. And everything else feels like it's the one-offs. I'm going to listen to this podcast in this episode because it talks about this, or this podcast in this episode because it talks about that. Not necessarily an entire series from one specific platform or person, you know?
Absolutely. But you know what is still a good strategy is getting yourself and your DMO as a guest on these top tier podcasts that are popping up. That from a PR perspective,
Absolutely.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
we're
And I
saying
think that's
not
where,
influencers, collaborators this year.
right, collaborators. And I think that's where a lot of destinations veered originally was, okay, let's get on the podcast bandwagon. We as a destination need a podcast. And there were so many other
Mhm.
agencies, people out here going, hey, we can help you with your pod. Like, let's get on the podcast bandwagon. And that made sense for a minute, right? While things were still baking, like things were still in the oven around destinations and podcasts. But now thinking about the time that's dedicated into the podcast circle of things, being part of the podcasts that makes sense for the topic, the campaign, whatever it is that you're trying to go after, or whatever message it is that you're trying to work through makes better sense in that time spent.
I think this is part of a broader conversation. We're kind of picking on this one piece, but honestly, look at the trends that popped off of 2020. We're 4 years past that now. We're almost 5 years in. This time to relook at recovery strategies and what we're really doing because some of these things were just quick, plug the hole so the water doesn't keep leaking. But thinking about the long term, and it was really hard. So I've got to give benefit there. You couldn't really look back in 2020, 2021 and say what was going to be the trends in 2025. Heck, if you say what the trends are next month, I'll call you a liar because you don't really know. So
Right.
there are those immediate pieces, but it is time to look at us again instead of just adding on and putting another stone on and adding another Jenga and doing this. Like, let's get real.
Yeah. No, yeah. And isn't it crazy that we're about to be in 2025? Like it makes you reflect. Just the number sequence is like, man, it's time to reflect. What are we
Hmm.
doing? How are we doing it? What could be better? What should be different? You know, and yeah, it is that point, and podcasts is like at one of the things at the top of this list to go back and look at strategy on and how has that evolved over the last 4 to 5 years, and how does it make sense for your business now? You know, how does that podcast make sense, or the time you dedicate? I think a lot of us, generally speaking, have all these great ideas for podcasts where it makes sense for us as a business or for us as individuals, but sometimes you have to take a step back and go, who's listening? Why are they listening? What is it that they're getting out of this podcast? Like, look at the data, really kind of make decisions from data, I think is where we're at. But yeah, there's so
Well,
much that we could talk about around the concept of podcasting going into 2025. Like, that should be a podcast.
a podcast about a podcast.
Yeah,
I
podcast
totally agree.
about podcasts. Yeah.
Yeah, I just see us adding on and and looking at these conferences and what they're also serving as content and talking to DMO leaders who are just their minds are blown. They're mystified in a lot of ways. Like they want to do keep up with the Joneses, but what does that really mean, for their destination, or their travel business? I think that is also like we're adding on too much. So we've got to pare down in a lot of our strategy and do it even better, do it better than anybody else.
Right. And for a lot of DMOs, because remember the struggle when podcasting as a destination was, the thing, everyone was kind of talking about it. There were a lot of DMOs who wanted to be part of it, but didn't have the bandwidth. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the technology. They didn't want to get involved with it. So it was like, well, how am I part of this trend? How am I part of this movement without really having the resources to be part of it? And I think those DMOs that we have to continue to think about, the DMOs that don't have the resources, that don't have the budget, don't have the bandwidth to really pull off something as big as starting their own destination podcasts, and learn from some of the successes, the things that they did in lieu of that actually paid off, sometimes even more so than having a destination podcast.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And also, like we mentioned earlier, if you are a destination who wants to get into that trend that don't have the bandwidth or the budget, guests on podcasts, advertising on podcasts is actually insanely cheap, cheaper than Facebook.
Right.
So there's a
Right.
lot of different ways to get in there. But speaking of
Absolutely.
adding things on and getting burned out, so doctors in Germany can prescribe you a paid 4 week spa vacation if you are a stressed out parent.
Of all the countries, number one. So also, why are we not doing this more in places where we actually live, Jennifer? Like, can we not get more of this? This is I mean, come on. I'm super proud for the just being as progressive as they are in this category because yeah, huge need.
They really are, but
Um,
Europe overall, coming to travel, Europe overall is much more like they think travel is a right, not a privilege. They get incredible times off. You know, a lot of people take sabbaticals for 3 months, 4 months at a time. Their jobs are always secure.
right, they take it very seriously, which is something that we need to do. Also, if we got that right here, I feel like we'd all be on a 4 week vacation.
That's the only problem. The problem is we can't do that because we'd crash our economy.
Unfortunately.
We would. And you look at
Uh,
those countries that are doing that, like Italy, you know, they're giving money for you to come buy a house there. They will give you money to come get their house. You know why? Because Italy's economy is flattened. There's a like 40 or 50% unemployment for people under 30. So, you know, it's a trap. Some of that's, I don't want to say a trap, but I mean, some of those things, the grass isn't always greener.
right, right. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely an investment to wait in
So
terms
we
of
may
when.
not be able to do a prescribed 4 week break, but I do believe, and I think we're seeing this trend in corporate America where people are starting to ease up on when people need. I saw this one, it was great. This TikTok, and this guy was talking to his new, or supposedly talking to his new boss. And he's like, when you come from a toxic work environment, he's like, okay, so I know it's my first day. What do I do if I get sick? Like, let's just say tomorrow. He's like, you take a sick day. He's like, but I just started. He's like, I don't understand the question. You take a sick day. He's like, well, what if my daughter's sick and it's not me? He's like, you take a sick day. He's like, what if I just don't feel? He's like, you take a sick day. Like, where did you come from? So it's
Yeah.
funny because that is, and that's of course our philosophy. You know, we have can any more days, whatever we need. But I think we are getting to understand that we are burning ourselves out. And if we want to keep really good, top tier strategic thinking talent, we got to give them more time.
More time, yeah, and to recognize when there's that feeling of being overworked or overburdened or just completely stressed out, like
Mhm.
recognize that and sometimes you have to force people, take the day, take the week, like go do what you need to do for yourself. And I think if we did that more as a collective workforce in this
Mhm.
country, we probably would be over here talking about Germany. They're prescribed 4 week vacations. I mean,
True,
we should do
true.
better. I
We
feel
should def-
like I feel like too at the same time, there is a lot more here, especially I think in our industry because we are in tourism and we are in travel and we obviously know how important it is. I do
Mhm.
feel like there's a lot more leeway happening and there's a lot more resource being offered to people, like coverage for if you do need some like mental health kind of check-ins, like making sure
Mhm.
that you're doing things collectively as a team and recognizing, doing more team building, taking more of the work from home opportunities where you can. So I mean, it's happening. It's just not happening as fast as it should be.
I think it'll accelerate here in the next 5 years because it's not us, it's not our generation that's asking for this. We'll work until we fall out dead in our chair. It's the, you know, the Gen Z and not even millennials. Millennials are the same too. It's really the Gen Z coming up going, I'm not doing that. They
Yeah.
think they have so many more options. And in some cases, they definitely do. So they're not willing to work a corporate job 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, 30 years. So it's got to be more attractive to keep that
Um,
workforce.
It does. And the work-life balance is so, like we were talking about that so many years ago, but it's even more important now. Like work-life balance is extremely important.
Especially if you're working from home. I find working from home can be more stressful than being in an office.
It can feel more stressful. Sometimes I think that the disconnect that can be created from that virtual space leaves a lot. Like I'm an overthinker, you're an overthinker. We're a collective overthinkers. And so it's hard sometimes to stay focused because it's the constant distractions of not, I guess not being able to put eyes on things immediately or not being able to
Mhm.
like have that immediate interaction sometimes. So it can be, I think that that's another topic that we should really delve into, I feel like for sure.
I totally agree. I cannot believe it's August. And this is going to be a hard month for a lot of people in the South and so forth to get travelers out. So definitely, push your cool patios and those sort of things because coolcations are what we have left here. I don't think anybody wants to get out in this damn heat.
Yes. So it's back to school month for a lot of
Mhm.
us. There's also, I know for a lot of DMOs that have tax-free weekends in their state, they're focusing a lot of those shopping excursions on around the tax-free weekend. Sort of like
So smart.
it's like inching out that last little bit of summer where you could
Hmm.
actually like get a little family time in, but also check off a few things for the back to school list. Um, Although we always say here in Texas that the back to school timeframe always backs up right to tax-free weekend. And so it's much harder for our DMOs in this state to really be like, hey, come plan a trip because you're literally turning around and sending your kids to school that Monday.
Yeah,
So that's a whole other topic that we need to fix here in this state is trying to time these weekends that should be really beneficial for our economy and our businesses with our actual school schedules because they seem to not want to ever talk to each other. But yeah, but we're also, I mean, I feel like our summer here hasn't been as brutal as it has been the last couple of summers, but I know collectively
I
in
think
this
that's what it is.
we're still dealing with a lot of people that don't necessarily want to travel within this heat of the summer. They want to
Mhm.
go further north. They want to, which, takes a little bit more legwork to get there, a little bit more time off that you got to spend getting there. But there's still some time to eke out some last minute summer
For sure.
travel.
For sure. I was surprised. I don't think Arizona has one, or I've never seen it advertised. But also, we go back to school in July.
Yeah, you
So,
guys have a funky school schedule too, so
mhm.
that, I think a lot of it too is we've sort of tax-free weekend for us is sort of merged into back to school shopping where they're kind of they don't necessarily have to be, connected in
Mhm.
that way. It's really just, give us a break for a weekend and take our tax away. Give us a slight break, but you know what? For $8 for every $100 that I spend, it's not really worth the amount of chaos and stress that because everyone wants to shop that weekend. So there's a lot of people that don't even take advantage of it. But it's still a good time frame to be like, get out, get your last minute back to school stuff. Also eke out a last minute summer trip
Mhm.
somewhere with the
Mhm.
kids.
Absolutely. And ESTO's coming up next week.
I know there's some good conferences
Good
coming up.
conferences.
What's that? The August 12th, I think.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then right after that is TACVB, Texas Association of CVBs conference, and that's the 20th through the 23rd in Austin. So yeah, there's some good conferences coming up. I think for most of us, we've sort of planned out like what our, fall conference travel schedule looks like, but it's
Mm.
really this is a good time earlier on in the year, not so much later in the year, to kind of start thinking about 2025 and what to budget for those October 1 fiscals, figuring out like where do I want to go as a destination? Where do I want to send my team? We've even been doing that. Like and conferences are getting so much more expensive now that you can't take your entire team to one conference. It's just
Right, right.
it can just blow the budget. And so figuring out like where to divide and conquer your resources, where you have maybe some of your creators on your team or your marketers on your team going to a conference that makes better sense for the tools they're using, and some of your leadership going to some of these bigger conferences.
Are your leadership going to a think tank and transformation retreat? Which we haven't
Yes.
talked about in a little bit, but we are actually decided the best time for that is breaking out the first of the year. So those dates are coming out soon, but we're really excited to keep talking about our think tank and transformation weekend too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's encouraging to see more DMOs doing more think tank type events in their destination with their stakeholders. Whether it be like you get all your restaurants together and you talk about social media for 2 hours. You know what I'm saying? Like workshops that really kind of dig into some of the specialties and things, tips
Absolutely.
and trends and things. So that's always good. But definitely as a DMO leader, we need more of like what we're trying to put together, those transformative events, which is a few days where you're with other leadership and you're really
Mhm.
concentrated on those conversations that are really meaningful right now without a
Absolutely.
lot of, chaos and noise from everything else.
Absolutely. So we're super excited to talk about that. We do have some new announcements, new things happening on the DI front. So if you're listening, keep listening. We'll be dripping those out as they come available. But great Tuesday tea. Again, I'm kind of thinking Germany sounds good, but I'm gonna stick here with a good old US and fight the good fight.
We're getting there. I think we're getting there. I think this is going to be one of those years where, everything's moving and shaking really drastically. And it's a election year. And so we just have to be willing to go with the flow and just
Mhm.
pivot. This is a kind of a year of pivoting where we need to pivot in
For
tourism. So we'll
sure.
get there.
For sure. For sure. Well, awesome. Well, hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Kristen, as always, I'll talk to you 800 more times today.
Yes, I'm sure you will.
Awesome. Thanks. You guys be good, and we'll talk to you next podcast.
Bye, guys.